Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It is my honor and joy to be with you. When I was at MDiv a long time ago, I'm not used to holding a microphone ever, so you're gonna have to forgive me on that. When I spent many hours in this very building. I lived on campus for 3 years, so I spent time in here during chapel. I also spent time in here not during chapel, singing, praying, crying, etc., at late hours. So it's a space I know well, and it means a lot that you've welcomed me back here to share a word with you all. I don't take that lightly, so just thank you very much. It's my honor to be here. The scripture today is the lectionary text from this last Sunday. I don't know if anyone had a sermon on this last Sunday, so I hope it is in keeping with that. I don't know. A fitting passage given the results of the recent election and the terrifying repercussions it has for so many of us. And as I read it, the question before the disciples in this text and before us today is very simple. How are we to live knowing that a catastrophe is just up ahead and for many is already here, has been here? What's Jesus' advice for people facing the end of their world? Now, at this point in the Markan narrative, Jesus has already set his face toward Jerusalem, waging a number of direct action campaigns at the heart of theopolitical power in his day. Jesus has theatrically entered Jerusalem, has turned over tables in the temple, has argued about the law, death, and taxes, and now the authorities are looking for a way to kill him because they are afraid of the power he has over the crowds. Immediately preceding the conversation we read this morning, Jesus sits and observes the comings and goings of temple procedure, exchange, and bluntly names the economic, material injustices done to ordinary people who put all they own in the treasury, widows' houses devoured, while devout prayers of thanks are offered for their sacrifice. Having done all these things, Jesus and the disciples are leaving the temple when someone remarks, "Look, what large stones and what large buildings." Perhaps just a random remark about how big the temple is, but I read it as a statement of seeming inevitability. Jesus, have you noticed how giant this institution is? I hear your criticism of the way temple practice is going, but it sure is big, isn't it? How could stones of this size ever be rolled away? Jesus, however, is undaunted. Do you see these huge buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. Perceived immovability is met with a reminder of contingency. What is in view here, of course, is the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Mark is writing around the time that a plurality of freedom fighters ready and willing to overthrow their oppressors have gathered enough people to take up arms against Rome. They are convinced of the rightness of their cause and thus that God would aid them in their fight. Mark is writing in and for a set of circumstances that is in the future for Jesus, the failure of this campaign and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, whatever one thought about the temple in the first century, whatever criticisms one had, and there were criticisms from within the fold, the temple was nevertheless one of these central structures that made one's world make sense. The divine presence was there in a special way. It was the center of Jerusalem's theopolitical life. It was the destination for national pilgrimages and yearly festivals. And it was, of course, the place where sacrifices were performed in accordance with the scriptures, not as some kind of burden, but as a grace whereby people could collectively repent and return to right relation with God. So the notion that the temple would be destroyed was a vertigo-inducing thought, even for those who were critical. It was familiar. It was big. If it was even possible to destroy it, what in the world would replace it? What would faithfulness to God look like in a post-temple world? Or would that simply be the end of us as a people? A hard thought to think, and a thought Jesus states bluntly. Like it or not, a disaster is coming, Jesus says, a series of events that will lead to destruction. And not in some distant future either. This generation will not pass away, Jesus says, before this occurs. Jesus sees the end of their world coming and refuses to do anything but look it square in the face. Now, this isn't a pleasant thought. Again, it's the lectionary text, so I want to stress that. But it does help clarify a passage that without this context can be and was confounding for me. When I was a kid, when I was a child, I was encouraged, kind of just ambiently encouraged, to read this as having to do with the end of the world, like literally speaking, in an eschatological sense. This interpretation produced more confusion than clarity for me, but as a teenager, it was the only option available, so I just kind of swallowed the difficulties and tried not to think about it too much. But these difficulties dissolve when one sees that Jesus is using apocalyptic imagery to describe historical events, and may even be lampooning those who claim the end of the world is soon to come. Jesus is talking about the end of their world, the end of the world as they know it. Jesus sees that everything they think they know about the world is fast coming to an end, and that they are only barreling faster and faster toward this hinge point in history. Put another way, this text is addressing a cultural political moment eerily similar to our own in many ways, at least as far as I can see it. For many of us, the preceding decades have been marked by a steady apocalyptic unveiling of what this country has always been about, an unmasking of forces that were always operative but were more or less hidden from view from many of us, for some of us, for different degrees, different times, different places, but a continual kind of unveiling of what this is really about. The contradictions of capitalism that are increasingly impossible to hide, cascading crises brought on by neoliberalism, privatization of any public good that's possible to privatize, financialization generally speaking, a political class almost totally captured by moneyed interest, a truly bipartisan reality. The continued stubborn reality of white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, American and American-backed imperial ventures that justify or even applaud the deaths of hundreds of thousands worldwide. And of course, not to even mention the turmoil brought by climate change, global warming, and its willful denial by so many in power, not least CEOs and tycoons of business. We seem to be barreling toward a series of disasters, an unlivable, unsustainable world, marked by the death of megafauna, coral reefs, heat waves, hurricanes, and floods, as Jesus writes, as speaks later, wars and rumors of wars, natural disasters, societal strife, and only the most tepid forms of response forthcoming by the nominal opposition. All that seems on the horizon for us and for our children. It seems inevitable. How can this not be? How can white supremacy, patriarchy, misogyny, trans bigotry, capitalism go away, be exorcised from our collective conscience? Look what large stones and what large buildings. The good news Jesus offers in response to this recognition, the wisdom he models for us, is not sweet or easy. He doesn't assure us that the disaster won't be that bad after all, as was read today. Or nor does he focus on techniques to help us achieve inner peace despite external turmoil. There is no wisdom and no liberation in pretending things are not what they are. In contrast with those who try to cope by saying that this or that deus ex machina will save us from climate catastrophe, let's say, or attempt to say that things are not after all that bad and things are better than they used to be, etc. Jesus does not sugarcoat what is in store. A lot of bad stuff is coming, and remaining faithful will come at great personal cost. This alone is an odd comfort to me, though, because I'm increasingly impatient with those who tell me that things are actually not as bad as they actually are. So it feels weirdly comforting to hear him just say straight up what is coming down the pike as far as he can see. And he is Jesus, so you know. But also notice the question that Jesus is asked by the disciples. When will this be? And what will be the sign that these things are about to be accomplished? Peter, James, John, and Andrew are asking a question about timing. How will we know that this is about to happen? When will the shoe finally drop? And Jesus refuses this question, I think. Using motifs that are common in the Judean and Israelite apocalyptic tradition, Jesus says that no one knows the day or the hour when that climactic shift will finally come. As though such titanic change could be relegated to a single moment anyway, rather than a series of cascading events. As though by knowing when a disaster will happen, one could somehow lessen its impact or prevent it from happening. Those of us who kind of came up in the 2000s can attest that awareness campaigns did very little to make the change we all wished for, because knowing better, unfortunately, does not automatically lead to doing better, although would that it did. Instead, Jesus tells the disciples to devote their energy to being prepared. Beware, keep alert. Faced with coming catastrophe, Jesus' word to the disciples is to cultivate the discernment necessary to come out on the other side. Not unscathed, not whole, whatever that would mean, but maybe collectively still here. Do not numb oneself to these increasing, intersecting atrocities through any number of prepackaged substances or media products or poisonous irony, maybe I'm talking to myself here, or the fantasy of moving to another country. Instead, burrow down, find people working for liberation and commit to one another. Hew close to those who have long cultivated the habits of resistance and joy required to flourish past this present age. People who already know the violence the system is capable of and have maintained their capacity for resistance and love, even as their worlds have ended. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be, Mary Oliver writes. But we must not let that numb our hearts to joy and pain alike. Against the temptation to despair that anything good is coming around the bend, or the temptation to run to the other voices claiming, "Here is the Messiah, I alone can fix it." Jesus says, keep awake. So do not be asleep, for to be asleep in such a time is to be in danger, susceptible to the violence of a master returning to the house. Jesus says, keep awake. In a world on fire, Jesus says, keep awake. What does that mean for us today in this room, to keep awake? I think it means refusing to look away from the injustices being done and soon to be done in the days ahead by the Trump administration. There might be a temptation to numb out, bliss out, spiritualize out, and away from what is happening. Instead, we must stay alert to what this administration does and will do to LGBTQ people, to women's right to choose what happens to their bodies, to public education, to immigrant communities, to public health, to vulnerable populations around the globe. This does not mean constantly doom scrolling, but it does mean refusing to permanently check out, under the false illusion that by ignoring it, you might avoid the worst of it. As Audre Lorde once wrote, of course, in a different context, your silences will not protect you. It also means, I think, rightly naming the enemy. Do not be tricked into thinking your enemy is the vast majority of people you interact with, or that the forces making our world unlivable are relegated to one and only one political party. There have been and will continue to be many who say the predicament we are in is because of a particular group getting too much attention or whatever, and the kind of post-mortem after the election. But don't be fooled by that, as far as I can see. Such moves are red herrings that distract and direct attention away from other things, like gross wealth disparity in this country, away from the rich, the powerful classes who would have you think that a particular voter in a particular county is primarily and chiefly responsible for the predicament we are in, and they are definitely not. It means not succumbing to conspiratorial, fantastical hopes of combating the forces at play by some kind of spiritual silver bullet, whether through the courts or particularly enlightened benefactors or whatever, by one more podcast, one more book, whatever. It means recognizing that no one is coming through that door. We are the ones we've been waiting for, to quote June Jordan. Finally, this is all but a way of saying that we must remain committed to the liberative work of Jesus, those of us who are so committed. To echo Toni Morrison, you already know what that means. You already know what the crucified, resisting Jesus would have you do. Feed the hungry, house the homeless, the houseless, strengthen worker rights and worker pay, provide health care to all without means testing it to death, oppose genocide, forgive debts, release the captives, set the prisoners free. Do not triangulate or moderate away from these commitments. Pursue them with abandon. Don't despair. Rather, find people who have caught this vision and hold tight to one another as you pursue Jubilee. Stay present to your life and to one another. Don't look away. Keep awake. Now, finally, let me leave you with this. And again, thank you for letting me be here to speak with you today. It's not exactly the most, it's what it is. But let me leave you with this. the world is what it is. I mean, I didn't do it. You know what I mean? I'm just here to preach a word that I've got based on the text in front of me. Let me leave you with this. Keep awake, Jesus commands his disciples. And yet not one chapter later in Mark, Jesus again commands these disciples to keep awake. Same words, same commandment, imperative, while he writhes in agony in Gethsemane, and they cannot obey. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, he says. In the days to come, as we together struggle toward liberation, it is a certainty that we will not all and always keep awake. The stresses of the journey are just too great. But even when the disciples fall asleep, that's not the end of the story for them. God, quote, goes ahead of them to make a way out of no way. Jesus comes to them again, risen, telling them once more to keep awake, to recommit themselves to the joyful work of beloved community. And we must, I think, if we were to remain in solidarity with one another in the days and years ahead, extend that same grace to one another and to ourselves, the same grace Jesus shows his slumbering disciples. As many times as we fall asleep, as we pursue liberation, we can yet begin again and begin again and begin again until kingdom come on earth as is in heaven. Thanks be to God.